Welcome back. Last week, we began our series on Prophet Muhammad by exploring the historical context in which he was born. Today, let's join Dr. Shabir Ally, president of the Islamic Information Center, to better understand the approach we should take to study the life of the Prophet. Dr. Shabir, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be on.
So can you tell us a little bit, why is it so important for Muslims and maybe even non-Muslim? What's so special about studying the biography of Prophet Muhammad? Because you don't necessarily hear that about other prophets.
Well, one of the interesting things about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is that his biographical information is so extensive. We have, in the case of the other prophets of God, very sparse information. Someone had estimated that if we took the sayings of Jesus, on whom be peace, that are found in the Gospels, and put them in newspaper-type columns, they would hardly fill like about 3 columns of a newspaper. In the case of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we have sayings upon sayings, a wealth of information. One might even say an embarrassment of riches. In terms of the details of his life, we have very extensive information about where he was born, how he grew up, his childhood, how the prophecy first reached him, what he did after that, year after year, almost like blow by blow. We have very detailed information. Why is this important to Muslims? Well, it's important for Muslims to know the details of the Prophet's life because Muslims want to emulate him, they want to follow him, they want to live the life that he lived. They want to
Why
copy his
him and not other
example.
prophets?
Well, for Muslims, he is the seal of the prophets. He is the final prophet that God has sent. And whereas Muslims follow all of the prophets indirectly, they follow the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, directly. You've also asked why a study of his biography might be interesting for non-Muslims. Well, non-Muslims want to understand the religion of Islam and Muslim peoples. They also want to know something about the historical development of this faith, as with other faiths as well. And so to know something about the historical development of Islam, they need to go back to the early days. They want to go back to the first person who preached this faith as it is known today, and that is the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They want to study his life and know what he said, what he did, where he went, and what he stood for.
So from an academic lens, how should we approach the study of the Prophet?
I'll preface that by saying that from the Muslim perspective, we have biographies that were written about the Prophet, peace be upon him. We received those, and generally within Muslim circles they are read as if they are just simple facts about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Academics don't take any such literature as simple fact. They try to look at the context in which the literature was written. They ask what were the influences that shaped the writing of the literature, why was it written this way and not some other way, who wrote it, when, and so on. So they would look for the earliest biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him. They would find that to be the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq died approximately 150 years after the Prophet Muhammad. So the 150 years of the Hijrah, so about 135 years or so after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so they would want to know then where this person got his information from and whether that information is accurate. Moreover, this writing, the earliest biography, did not survive in its original form. We have a redacted form by a later writer. A later writer took that writing and made some changes to it. He is known as Ibn Hisham, and today when we study Ibn Ishaq's biography, the earliest biography, we're studying it in the form that Ibn Hisham gave us. Now, Ibn Hisham died approximately 200 years after the death of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So that means that for a couple of hundred years, the information was being circulated orally, and then, well, for 100 years or so orally, put into writing, and then we have like a truncated version of that earlier writing, a redacted version, one with changes, coming to us in its final form a couple of hundred years after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So naturally, historians will approach this kind of writing with a little bit of skepticism.
You mentioned there are so many variations. How should we treat them, thinking about modern Islamic studies, like what's the role there?
Well, I want to say that too, that even classical Islamic studies did not take the biographies as 100% truth about our Prophet, peace be upon him. In fact, it is noted that Imam Malik, one of the great scholars and the founder or the eponym of one of the four major schools of Islamic jurisprudence, he did not have very much regard for Ibn Ishaq, who I've named as the earliest biographer. So what's the difference here? For let's say critical Muslim scholars of ancient times, it was important to know who said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, either said something or did something or acquiesced to something. We want to know the source of the information. Since Ibn Ishaq did not live in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, his information has to come from somewhere. And we want to know, did he get his information from eyewitnesses? So the earliest classical Muslim scholars who were critically examining reports about the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not like the biographies too much, because the biographies, in order to have like a long connected narrative about the Prophet, peace be upon him, you had to be loose in accepting information. Whereas if you wanted to have the pure information about the Prophet, peace be upon him, you wanted to make sure that it comes from an eyewitness, that it was memorized and passed down, even though orally, but with care, so that we know the exact words that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said. Well, then you can only have a snippet of information. Think, for example, of a Muslim trying to memorize a very long surah of the Quran. How much work would that entail to memorize the whole thing? But if you wanted to memorize a short surah of the Quran consisting of, let's say, 3 or 4 verses, like Kul Huwallahu Ahad, for example, then that's more easy work, right? And you can more rely on your memory if you memorize that short surah rather than a long one. Now, the biography is like a long surah, like a very, very long one, longer than the Quran itself. Whereas a hadith usually is a very short report about something the Prophet, peace be upon him, said or did. So a person like Imam Malik then, whom I named as the eponym of one of the 4 schools of Islamic jurisprudence, would be more interested in the shorter report, because that is more likely to be authentic. If somebody comes and says, well, I heard from my teacher that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said X, if the X is short, we can more rely on this person. Yeah, it sounds like you learned this from your teacher, you memorized it, you're passing it on. But if the X is very long, like a whole book length, like we're going to wonder, how did you memorize this whole thing? So you might have been reporting with changes. And so what was born in classical Muslim study is the critical study of hadith, to scrutinize every little snippet of information about the Prophet, peace be upon him. And that sort of information was collected in separate books known as hadith literature. But the difficulty with hadith literature is that while you have the little snippets, you don't have a contextual framework to know when did the Prophet, peace be upon him, say this one little thing. So to know when he said things and what kinds of things he was saying at various points in his life, we need the biography. So you see there's an interplay between the study of the Quran, the study of hadith, study of the biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him.
Is one more valid than the other? One might argue, you mentioned some are shorter and then they validate right back to the Prophet, but then some might be longer. But then some people might say the longer ones perhaps give more context. So how do we know that maybe that's not necessarily just as true? Like, how would you
Well, you have to balance. You have to balance the information. In fact, I spoke earlier about the skepticism of modern scholarship, and there are various approaches to this and varying degrees of skepticism. Some are so skeptical that they want to throw out all of the biographical information and all of the hadith information altogether, and they want to start with like a tabula rasa, a clean slate, and try to reconstruct what happened in the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But that work was found to be impossible. You can't do it that way. Moreover, some scholars like Robert Hoyland and Harold Motzky, Gregor Scholler, a whole school of German scholarship emerged to show that in fact the hadith and biographical information do contain some snippets of core, solid information about the Prophet, peace be upon him. You can't just throw that all out of like the baby with the bathwater. You need to have a critical approach, but you need to differentiate between the wheat and the chaff. Through a careful study, you can identify some core elements. And William Montgomery Watt put it nicely when he said that you can, by studying the Sirah works, you can find a kind of progression in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You can, in a sense, get an idea of the year after year events in the life of the Prophet. Let's say especially when it came to things like the major battles, like there was the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, the Battle of the Trenches, and then eventually the Fath, or the opening of Mecca for Muslims to be able to live there and practice their faith, and finally the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. You see actually a progression of events in the life of the Prophet this way. And whereas the specific details about these events are not necessarily authentic, the core narrative that shows that there is this progression of events, that itself is authentic. And when we know that, we have a contextual framework within which to understand the revelation of the Quran itself. Otherwise, you'll be reading the Quran today and you don't know what was said when. Because passages of the Quran were revealed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, at specific junctures in his life, commenting on things that were happening. By seeing that framework, which William Montgomery Watt thinks to be authentic, we now have the authentic framework within which to say, oh, this part of the Quran was revealed in the first year after the Hijrah, this other part in the 9th year of the Hijrah. And what is the significance of saying this first and this one second?
We'll leave that as a question to carry on our next show.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.